Welcome to the DataStack Show. Today we're going to talk with Tristan from Acceldata, and he works for an observability company. And I'm sure you have questions about that, Kostas. My burning question is actually around the type of company that he has served in his work in, sort of data engineering and ML throughout his career. So he worked at Oracle, he worked at DataRobot, and now he's at Acceldata. And we're talking about big enterprises who are facing data challenges that, let's say you're sort of standard like Silicon Valley data startup, like it's a very different customer than they're serving. And I think that market is huge, relative to how we kind of think about the legacy companies. So I just want to ask him about that because I think he's going to help me and our listeners like develop more of an appreciation for that world, if they don't already live in it. So that's what I'm going to ask. How about you?
Yeah, I'll be a little bit more predictable than you, I guess, in what I'm going to ask. We've been talking with quite a few other vendors in this space, like with data quality, data observability. It's a very interesting and very vivid market. So I want to see and ask him like how they perceive data observability, like what it is, why we name it the way we name it, and what the people are using it, and like get a little bit more into like the problem space and the product itself, and see how it works and how it delivers value.
Great. And you just used the word vivid to describe a market, and so you get some vocab points. You get some major vocab points for describing a market as vivid. And what concerns me about that is you might actually turn into a venture capitalist if you keep using that language. Okay.
Maybe one day, who knows?
Okay, let's go talk about observability with Tristan. Tristan, welcome to the DataStack Show. So great to have you.
Thanks so much for having me here. I'm excited to join the illustrious list of guests we've had here and hope to hopefully live up to it.
Oh yeah, so many fun things to talk about. Okay, give us your background and tell us what led you to be head of product at Acceldata.
Sure. So for me, it's actually a long story that starts with being a philosophy major and getting into semantic webs and all this stuff. But basically that took me through a path with the Endeca group at Oracle, working on sort of search, BI, analytics, big data, things like that. And then I found this nice Boston company called DataRobot, and sort of got in there, one of the early product managers, and sort of, helped see that grow from where we were to now, big company, big player in the AI, ML, auto ML space, things like that. And so the interesting thing about that though, and really the thing that led me to Acceldata, is that when you sit at that end of the spectrum of the data sort of data lifecycle spectrum, you're dealing with these ultra refined data sets, the best data sets that there are, and you're doing some really sophisticated things on top of it. But for a company that's based, or was based really around automation and can we automate a lot of the data science lifecycle, like what you start to notice is when that works really well, but then you run out of problems because there simply isn't data sitting around that's perfect, that's pristine, even in a static form, much less in an actual dynamic data pipeline that would be suitable to run out. And so looking at this on the one hand, in one ear, I'm hearing about all these awesome developments in the machine learning world, across the world, like it's incredible what's happening. In the other ear, I'm hearing, oh no, like we're not ready for ML, like we can't do that yet. So we're not ready for that. And so, for me, one of the things I was sort of looking at is like, is there a way, like what are the barriers to being in a world where something like ML, DataRobot, tools like that can be used, constantly, nonstop, because we've solved this data problem. And Acceldata is a really interesting company, sort of sitting, in the middle of this, sitting at the layer, not where, it's sort of moving data between places, but where it's kind of observing all these tools together. And so I thought this is a really interesting thing. Obviously, observability, application observability, application monitoring, huge areas. I know there's a debate to be had, hey, does that really apply to data as well? And I think, my take, my bet, and, I think people on this podcast may agree as well, but like there's so much diversity and so much innovation happening in the data world that, my belief and our belief at Acceldata very much is like, yeah, let's go into this. Let's understand all of these rich tools that are, becoming increasingly specialized, increasingly powerful, and kind of provide a common layer to understand all aspects of your data pipelines. So that's kind of my story in brief, and excited to see this. I think it's turned out to be, these pipelines are as messy as we thought, and the benefits from cleaning them up are as appreciated as you would imagine.
Yeah, love it. Okay, so Kostas knows exactly the question that I'm going to ask, and actually, this is in your wheelhouse because it's related to philosophy, Kostas.
Yeah.
And you come from sort of the seed of philosophy. Philosophy. Of course, he's laughing. Okay, this is something that I've asked a ton of people on the show, and it's probably one of my favorite questions because it's just so fascinating to see how people's sort of education and experience influences their work, especially when their sort of training doesn't necessarily fit a mold of what you would think of for someone who ends up, in sort of a very data heavy or engineering heavy role. So how did studying philosophy, what are some of the main things that have influenced your work as an engineer or working with data that came from your study of philosophy?
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting question, and then there's answers at different levels of this. So I think one of them that's I think will resonate with everyone that works with data is you'll find that most of your time actually is in some sense about philosophical debates here. Like, well, how do you define what really is sales? And which way do we do this? And is the thing we really care about this or the thing we care about that? And of course, you're answering, at some level, this is all about answering things with data, but at the meta level of actually defining and articulating the connection between these things and what you're looking at and what matters, it's precisely the question that the data can't answer because the data has been structured, with one thing there. So I think, on one side, there's all the fun arguments with that. I think, the tactical answer for me actually was that, a lot of what I ended up doing actually was in the maybe initial attempted heyday of the semantic web, that things like this was really trying to go out and map, it's essentially data modeling by a different name. So map a domain, get into these nasty, legacy databases and kind of map those to these beautiful ontologies that we created in OWL and all these things, but really underneath is all this nasty SQL query. So I think that also, is an element of operating at multiple levels here and kind of connecting the things together. But for me personally, I went through this path of, wrangling data, just throw it out there, make things work, figure out what is Linux, how does, how to work with the command line, things like that. But where I ended up was in product management. And so product management, I think, is a great, example of sort of applied philosophy and its most glamorous parts, which are maybe 2% of the time. The other 90%, 98% is a little different skill set. But, I think the parts where it's relevant, it really is about trying to clarify, what you're working on here and what's worth doing it. And are you doing it for the right reasons or not? And so I think I've always been one of those annoying, product managers, I think, who wants to know, won't let someone get away with well, we're doing this because it's just easy, it's things like that. We're going to do that. Or oh, it won't take too much time, right? And I think everyone who's worked in projects and worked in technical projects knows that, it always takes more time than you think, even taking into account that it takes more time than you think. And so I think being really careful about, why is this important, something to work on? Why are you really, the best in your category, or why does it make sense to win in this dimension becomes something interesting. So I think those are all traits, but I think the biggest trait of all was really, you spend time, in these philosophy classes, and then you realize this is a, waste of time. And I want to get hands-on and build something, and you become really impatient to actually build stuff. And you get really tired of talking about philosophical debates because it's pointless. So,
yeah, you don't actually ship something at the end of a philosophy class.
Exactly. And that's really what it is. It's you come in and you're oh, I spent all this time arguing, things like that, whatever. And then you're oh, wow, I can write some code and it does this cool stuff. Or I can work with people who know how to write code very well, or do excellent designs, or sell things, or make solutions work. And, that's incredibly rewarding, and you never want to go back to what you're doing before.
Yeah, for sure. No, I love it. I've worked with some people who have studied philosophy over the years, and some of the best people are like running down to the you know, sort of root of a problem or a question. And it is like, it can be difficult, right? Because you're just like, we're trying to move fast here, right? But like answering those fundamental questions is so important for sort of producing, you know, ultimately what can be sort of the best outcome. Okay, I know Kostas has a ton of questions on the technical side, and we want to try to define observability and do some of those things. But one thing I'd love for you to give some perspective on is that, you know, we have the benefit of talking with a wide range of people on the show, right? So we've talked with some founders who are building some like really neat tools, you know, sort of new tools, stuff that's like spun out of like Uber and LinkedIn and open source technologies, like really, really cool stuff. You've spent a decent bit of your career sort of operating at a strata that, you know, probably the people who are working in, you know, let's say just the Silicon Valley data startup, like, you know, just aren't as exposed to, right? So like Oracle, Data Robot, like we're talking about companies who have been around a lot longer, right, than maybe some of the customers of these newer Silicon Valley companies. So they're literally built on technology that's just been around for a lot longer, which has a lot of implications. That market's also like pretty large. And the data problems that they face are pretty different. And I would just love to get your perspective, you know, sort of what are the things that you see in terms of the challenges that sort of, you know, call it like enterprise strata or companies that have been around for like multiple decades that like have technology and run their business on technology that they adopted when it was state of the art 20 years ago, but like, you know, are still running that today and trying to modernize. So any thoughts on that would be just helpful to give us some perspective?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's always been eye-opening, I think, to go around and you realize, you know, and you work in B2B, you know, products anywhere, like you realize all of these companies and all these layers of the economy, basically, and like of society that maybe you didn't know about before. And so I think, you know, certainly as you work in these enterprise software companies, you realize things are, you know, maybe more complex than at least I had thought as you get in there. And I think as you actually start working with these companies, you know, you realize their internal landscape is incredibly complex. And so the reason, you know, we have such awesome, you know, sort of modern startup companies or companies that have now, you know, gone public and things like that, the Ubers of the world is the classic example, the Facebooks, you know, these are able to move fast, you know, because they don't have a lot of things weighing them down. Like they're able to do things differently. They're able to build things that they want. And then they get to a scale where they have to do things, you know, that the way that they want to, or a way that hasn't been done before. And then you end up with, you know, Presto, Trino, you know, it's like in any number of other examples that came out of Uber or LinkedIn or like this. Yep. And I think those become quite appealing to the next wave of the companies. So the next generation comes out and says, look, like we've, you know, we know what you're feeling. We're operating at huge scale. Like we were, you know, we started with an app, you know, that's what we had. And we go from there. I think, you know, if I look at the challenges that these companies have, and the reason it's sometimes you end up with different fits and different product priorities for that group. I think, you know, one is maybe the obvious one, but there is a history here of technology investments. And so I think the obvious aspect of that is that, okay, there's a lot of technology around that, you know, is not the new, you know, cool one. It's not, people aren't giving talks about it, things like that, but it's been around, it's driven the company for a long time. And there are also people there that, you know, have used it and know how to use it. And that's just what they do and things like that. And so I think, you know, one of the things then that you need to consider is like, obviously integrations, you know, how do you connect with those things like that? But I think more than that is actually looking at the change process. So like these companies are very smart people. Like these are giant companies. Like they've been very successful. They've been around for a long time for a reason. And the people in sort of decision-making, you know, and leadership and architecture roles there are always thinking about how do I transition this? And they're always thinking about previous rounds of choices that have been made and how to basically, you know, do better in the future and things like this and help with the migration. And so, you know, I think, you know, one of the interesting things about sort of the Acceldata background actually is like a lot of the core founding engineers, these were Hortonworks engineers. So they were very much, you know, building out Hortonworks and this, you know, powerful Hadoop system,
sure.
System helping install it and support it at these super complex installations. And so
Yeah.
I think they all had and I had a different layer when I was at Oracle, had a different view, different perspective on this, of the same phenomenon, right? Of people going very big on, this technology that seemed to offer a lot of promise, for sort of cheaper compute and bigger processing and things like that. And then, in some cases, I think there were successes with Hadoop, but in many cases, like now it's viewed as, probably it was an over investment in many cases. And people are looking, like, how do I deal with that investment? So I don't just leave it, I make use of it. I transition to the part that makes sense to transition. I leave the parts that are there. On the other hand, now that I'm evaluating the new wave of technologies, the modern data stack, so-called, and maybe there'll be a data stack after that, like you're going to be facing the same discussion, like, hey, how do I actually evaluate this? Like, and how do I adopt this in a responsible way that's not sort of like lurching from one thing to the next? And I think, so navigating, these decision processes is definitely something that's quite relevant for these groups, because they're looking at a much wider span and much more significant tracks here. So I think, certainly for Acceldata, one of the places where we spent some time with people is basically, starting to become the experts on this modern data stack and trying to advise people on this in an informal way. Like we want them, we want them to be successful running these workloads. Like we want them to adopt new things, and we want to stay, like everyone here, like we want to stay like abreast of what's the latest, technology here and the best choice for what option. So I think that also, these organizations will also not always be hiring people who are going to be contributing to open source or like masters of open source. They'll be buying, but there is a role as well to kind of understand, their needs and help bring that in a responsible way. So yeah, I don't know if that gives a sense. Like it's a little, it's a kind of like little different and in some ways much more, I want to say diverse in terms of the types of challenges you face. Constrained in some ways, but also open in some others, given that the budgets and the size of these companies.
Sure. No, I appreciate that so much, because I think it's easy to lump a lot of things under like the legacy umbrella, when in fact and I just appreciate so much that you said, like, there are really smart people trying to navigate, like, how do I modernize a stack that has had tens or hundreds of millions of dollars invested in it over, a decades long period, and like steer that, and sort of make good on that investment over time. And like, man, that is a really difficult challenge.
Think about it. Like, I think many people, here with like have experience with, technical refactoring, and like, it's not it's a rare, engineer who's able to come in and take, sort of a quote legacy code base or a really complicated pipeline or things like this, and kind of, gradually improve that, both of what we have now and sort of restructure it in a new way. Like that's something, it's a lot more fun in many ways. And it's not necessarily easy to build something from scratch, but it's just a different skill set and things like that. So, but it's tough. I mean, it's the price of success for a lot of companies, is like they've built this, they've invested in technologies, they've succeeded in fulfilling those use cases in most cases. And now, you don't want to, there's an explore, exploit, dimension for them as well. Although I don't think it'd be phrased that way, but, I think, I mean, when they're confronted with an endless stream of a million startups pitching them on their unique thing, like how you decide between that, I think becomes an interesting place.
Sure.
So Tristan, I have like a couple of different questions, but I'd like to start with the basics. So let's talk a little bit about data observability, right? So what is data observability, and why we use the term observability there and not something else like data monitoring, or I don't know, why observability is the right word for what we are doing?
Yeah. So I think, before we get into data, like I think generally, people draw a distinction sometimes between monitoring and observability. And I think, monitoring is meant to be kind of telling you that something has happened, I think in many cases, and drawing your attention to it. I think people use observability often to say, this is the thing that helps you understand the internal state of what's happening. Basically, it gives you enough information, not only to see the symptom, but to go in and find the cause very quickly. And so you see different tools, do this to different degrees, but I think that's where that's mentioned. Now with data, I think what's interesting is that, and you'll sometimes see, like you could ask a similar question around data quality versus data reliability and things like this. And so I think the interesting thing with data is that, many of the use cases have existed for quite a long time. So data quality, like and BI, dashboards, reporting, things like this, like these are not novel concepts. They're done likely much better now than they were in the past. The tools are really awesome, but fundamentally, it's still the same question, and the scenario is still the same. The social scenario is still the same. I'm in the room, I'm the analyst, I presented it, I'm trying to convince someone to do something. They ask, that number can't be right. Like, where'd you get that? How'd you get that? Like, why is this data wrong? And so I never, that's a bad feeling. You don't want to be doing that, and you want to make sure it doesn't happen again. So I think that use case of kind of, hey, I'm monitoring the data, like, tell me if there's something weird that's on this, I think is an established one, and fits with data quality, and there's things that do that. Where I think data observability is different is it's really applied to some of the newer, and in some sense, more taxing use cases, like where you're actually providing a service to the outside world, whether that's a product, whether it's recommendations, whether you're literally selling your data, or your analytics to a third party, which I think is, or in a marketplace like, Snowflake obviously is promoting this, and Databricks, things like that. So like, I think when you get into that situation, when it's not that you're going to feel awkward or like your colleagues are going to lose trust in you, it's like you're literally going to lose business because this is broken, or it's delayed, or it's wrong, and no one's going to tell you either. They're just not going to show up again. I think that's where understanding the internal state becomes quite important. So for us, I think observability means, not just do I know that something happened, but how do I dig into the layer that I need to dig into and figure out why that is. And just to give an example of what that would mean, like, let's take the classic one of like, hey, my pipeline is delayed, like what's going on? Okay, so it's one thing to know, I think it's monitoring to know, hey, this pipeline's delayed, let's go figure it out. It's another thing to know, okay, let's go into, this pipeline, let's say, was using, Confluent for streaming. It was using Databricks to do some large scale aggregation. I don't know, maybe it was using Databricks for streaming too. And then it's landing something in a, in a data warehouse, and it's using Snowflake for that. And you're running queries against that, and that's what's delayed. So I think actually isolating at what point in this cycle, like this became slow, I think is quite important. I think then digging in and saying, okay, now show me essentially the Databricks console or information gathered from it on what's going on. And, was this constrained, or like, did I have the wrong number of executors? Like, was my data skewed? Like, what happened here to cause this? Am I shuffling tons of data? Like, that's the level where I think you get into true observability, in the sense that that term is used, in the broader, non-data context too. So I think it's quite, we see it as quite intensive, I would say, or more comprehensive than monitoring. And they're like fairly serious about saying like, yeah, if this was monitoring, like it's a great thing. As with BI dashboards, there's better generations of that now than there were in the past. But I think, we see observability as the thing that's going to let you actually control and optimize and basically operate this in a predictable way.
Mm-hmm. Is observability more relevant to the infrastructure that handles the data, or to the data itself, or both is actually needed at the end?
So my sense is broadly that it's both, because, and I find it hard to decouple them for a couple of reasons. So I think one is that, as you get into these data platforms, like the actual structure of the data has a huge impact on the basically the compute layer. So like, just to take the Spark example as well, like if you do have data that's coming in and that data has drifted in certain ways, like that's going to make whatever configuration and whatever resource provisioning you'd have before inadequate and suboptimal. And like at the volumes and the velocities you can be talking about, like that can be a quite significant difference. Mm-hmm. Likewise, I think as you start playing it out and you start looking at, I'm doing this complex data pipeline, it's going against multiple things, like, I mean, timing becomes a factor as well. So if this is supposed to be read from this table at this time, and this upstream job was delayed for whatever compute reason, like now you're going to have semantic problems in your data, that ultimately were caused by an infrastructure issue. So I think in my view, certainly there's an aspect of being able to dig into this and underneath, but, even it's almost hard to detangle them, even though I understand like traditionally, like it kind of has had this division of like, okay, I'm a data analyst type of person. I look at this, analytics engineer, I look at this, and, maybe I'm an IT engineer, I look at this. I kind of, my read on this is that, especially as we move to sort of cloud environments where you're not asking your central IT team to manage this stuff, you as the data engineer interacting directly with the cloud provider and using their services, this starts to become more of a blending of skills that are or let's say of concerns that were used to be separate.
Yeah, makes total sense. Can you give us a little bit like of more actually a few examples of like what's the experience that someone has with the product itself? Let's say that I know that I have a problem with my data in my pipelines, and I'm convinced by your salespeople that observability is the solution to all my problems. So what happens next? How do I implement that? And what I'm interacting with in order to experience the data observability?
Yeah, and I'll try to give a broad answer to this. Like I do think we have a unique take on observability and do things a certain way. I think other people do it, and I'll try to answer it in the general way here. Like I think the way that I see this happening effectively is basically I think there's two entry points that people look at. One of which I would prefer or recommend to the other, but like one of them is sort of connect to a data source, and in many solutions you'll see this. I mean, I think this is a little bit of a division in the industry, or the micro industry that we're talking about, the data observability industry. But basically, you might connect to the data source, which might be a data warehouse, or it might be a files, or it might be a stream. I think, and you might at that point say, okay, these are all going to be basically analyzed by this data processing service. It's going to look at, on the one hand, the compute layer of where this is actually going through and sort of like the jobs that are processing. It's going to extract that from the provider, and it's going to actually look at the data itself and compute distributions on it, like analyze it for anomalies, like everyone's building these like little simple time series models that forecast if a value is tell you if a value is anomalous or things like that. I think that's one way to do it. I think the way to do it that is we've seen a lot more excitement around has been actually instrumenting the pipeline itself. So these days, I think it's part of the unbundling or whatever, or rebundling, whatever. Like there's a lot more code-based pipelines now. Like you're not necessarily dropping in. Obviously, the drag and drop ETL vendors still have a huge market, but like many new initiatives, especially ones that are serving external customers, are basically pursuing like code-based frameworks. So you're coding it and then you're orchestrating it with Airflow or Dagster or Prefect, or like the list goes on and on. And so I think the way that we've seen people get really excited about, especially the people responsible who are not writing the pipelines, but the people responsible for keeping track of the 10,000 pipelines that are written, is actually to basically decorate these pipelines and have that information emitted back to the mothership here, and have that actually give you this digest of the same type of information, like what's happening, what's going on with this data set, does it have values out of range, is it not passing rules, as well as let's get a read on the actual query statistics, or the load on the database at this time, and show you what that looked like. So I think there's a couple entry points that you look at here. I would say in terms of what happens, like what's the experience as a user, like supposing that you have this set up, I think there's two phases. So one phase is defining and sort of setting up, what types of things you analyze. So sometimes people refer to these as tests or, quality checks or dimensions, things like this. And it's very important. I'd say my philosophy on this, is basically to try to automate as much as possible. And it pains me every time someone has to write a test here, right? Like what I really want to do with data is be able to say, hey, I know that you have certain expectations of your data. Like it's not going to drift, the values aren't going to be here. And you can define those things in a way that you can't actually even define them for software. So with data, there's a way to measure distribution drift. There's a way to forecast if things are anomalous, things like that. And those, in my view, and in our view, Acceldata should be applied, in an automated way as possible. Once you've got all these things set up, of course, it's not always possible to automate it. Like, you want to write code, like you have custom rules, you need to look across multiple columns. So like there is this aspect, it's never going to be fully automated, but you want to push it as much as possible. Once you have that instrumented, it basically becomes, in some sense, a familiar pattern, right? You're getting an alerting framework, you're getting told what's going on, you're getting an incident filed, you're jumping in, and you're sort of seeing all these things connected together. I would say the only big difference with data that you'll sometimes see is that people will want, and we had a big sort of data seller, requests and drive this feature, you'll want to actually split up some of the records, that might have failed and sort of segregate them from things that go in. So, there's a sense where, especially when you're dealing with files, like very early in the stream, you want to filter out, in quarantine or whatever you want to call it, like basically some of the things that are a little suspicious before that ends up contaminating, kind of your golden warehouse data or whatever's going into your model or things like that.
Mm-hmm. And who's the user? Or who, let's say, takes care of observability? I mean, in the infrastructure world, like things are like pretty clear there. You have like the SREs. I mean, they're like the primary consumers of like observability products, right? And for a very clear and good reason. Like when it comes to data, though, because like things are a little bit more complicated there in terms of who are the consumers and who are all the different stakeholders there. Who is the primary user of an data observability tool?
Yeah, in our experience, it's data engineers, but it's not all data engineers, and it's not all the time. Mm-hmm. So what I mean by that is basically, data engineers like machine learning engineers, like data scientists, like analytics engineers, like these terms are kind of telescoping or whatever you want to call it. There's an explosion in specialization on these, and like I don't know that the terms that we use for them or the job descriptions have actually perfectly lined up like with where it actually is today, let alone where it's going to be in a few years. I've also seen job posts for data quality engineers, data reliability engineers, things like that. So we've seen these. So I think, there's something where if you play this out a few years, there may be a specific role similar to how there are SREs now, where there's cloud ops, focused people that are focused on ops things. My view at this point is, it's sort of like the responsible data engineer, like, who's looking at this. And I would say importantly, kind of that management chain. So I think as you're getting up and you want a view into what people are doing, that becomes the primary, user of an observability system. Like the first use case is, of course, hey, I've got this, I've got my pipeline, like, why is it broken? Let me know like how to fix it as quickly as possible. I think that's a clear one. I think there are larger ones as you step back though. And like the more you get removed, like the more that you go from having 5 pipelines that you're monitoring to 10,000. And like, I don't know if this number sounds incredible to people, but like we absolutely have heard, we have customers that have 10,000 pipelines that they want us to monitor here. Like it's just insane, the sprawl. Yeah. It's like, it's become so easy and so powerful, the tools, that like, if you're someone sitting in the central group here and you're trying to keep tabs on it, like you have no idea what someone downloaded and what they're running and what data they're using. And like, should they be using that data? Like if someone asked to delete that data, would you know? Like, and so, at Acceldata, like I would say one of the things that we found is like people start to get very interested when they're like, wait, you can instrument our data pipelines, and sort of keep an eye on them and tell us what's going through them. Like that starts to be quite interesting, both to buyers as well as to, people in sort of the data governance type world. But I think the further out that the more that you aggregate this type of information, the more that you're actually getting, like, if you come back to these people we talked about earlier, or the people judging, and carefully considering the technology investments, you're starting to get a map of like what your business is actually doing with data, like which systems are being used, which pipelines actually work, which pipelines feed into others, which pipelines are reliable, who is reliable, who is not. So you start to get, even though the initial user is like absolutely the data engineer who just wants to get their stuff working and keep it running and, be able to progress to the next thing. This does end up, having different users as you grow and expand it.
You touched like something very interesting, and I would like to ask a little bit more about that. So, okay, let's say we instrument our pipelines. Now we are able like to monitor things. Everything goes well, like as it should. And at some point, like something breaks, right? And you get your notifications, and like the data engineer will go there and fix it probably. Okay, but like the difference between something like data and like observability of a server, right, is that like the impact that you have with data, it's much, how to say that, like it's much more difficult to calculate, right? Like to figure out like what happened to the organization at the end, like how many reports like were wrong because of that. So how do we deal with that? Like, is there something that we do today? What's your experience with the organization that you have worked with? Like, what happens after the incident?
So this one, I think my experience with this actually comes more like from the ML world, like at DataRobot, and looking at like what happens with when you deploy a model and you start feeding data into that model and it starts doing things. And then, it's, obviously I think the case everyone's probably familiar with is with dashboards. And of course, this affects a dashboard report. You can see this, I think with models, there's an increased sensitivity, like one, just because it's a kind of a newer technology and people have concerns about it, too, because of potential, regulatory reputational things where you start putting out like biased data or just like obviously garbage things, and people come back and mock you about it on Twitter and things like that. So I think, I think broadly with data, like there's one aspect that's just, being able to understand the whole flow of what's being used, and that I think there's no way around this other than kind of, having integrations with the various end steps here. So I think people are certainly very curious. Okay, this, we've got a history of historical runs here. This one went bad at this phase, and now show me everything that was impacted by this. And so this is something that we built out in Acceldata to sort of show the downstream impact across all these tables, things like that. But it's a bit of an infinite like spiral here, where like there's the people that there's the tables affected by it, there's the reports affected by that, there's the people who looked at those, there's the choices they made off of those, there's the customers affected by those choices. Like, I don't think there's ever, you're right that there's never enough, that you can really trace this all the way through, in the way that, with software, maybe sometimes you can say, these people hit this and they failed.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I think like, you can at least trace that chain through a few steps here and say this was used in the cases I'm familiar with, like this data was used, like this batch of data was used by this model, which made these predictions, which were off in these ways. Let's go back, and make sure, like if it's these customers, like we score them again better, or we actually go back and offer them again because we gave them a terrible offer last time we messed up the data going to the model.
Yep, 100%. And I think that's where like things are more complicated and more interesting with data, because that you have observability. We are talking about that, right? Like, because that's what like Acceldata is doing right now. But then you start thinking, okay, if I also have other, let's say, capabilities that come from data governance, like lineage. Okay, so I have, let's say, like a track of like how the data got consumed and how it changed, and like all these things. Then I can start like tracking like what's the impact there. And then if I also have like proper like auditing mechanisms that is in place, I see the people that are like getting involved and affected by that. So what are like the, let's say, the parts of data governance specifically, but like in broader terms, like the data stack elements that you think are important, like value multipliers for data observability and vice versa, right?
Yeah, and this has really been, I'm glad you asked this, because this has really been one of the key like areas that I've been looking at and trying to think through, like in the time that I've been in Acceldata. And I think it's one that everyone is sort of thinking through as well. And I think I would answer it basically with the theme that we've talked about throughout this discussion a little bit, which is really the theme between sort of like existing and new and modern data stack. I don't know what you call the sort of existing data stack in a nice way. But basically like the previous data stack or the current data stack and the modern new data stack. And I think the fascinating, like it's an easy distinction where like basically I think a lot of the data governance things are almost, and you even hear it in the word lineage, like it's almost a standing still, like studying how things are fitting together, and almost an academic, it has very real applications in terms of data, privacy, data protection, things like this. But it is almost sort of understanding like what's the intended, connection between some of these things. I think where observability, has proven to be quite useful additional lens on this is basically for these people that are not working in the data warehouse, like they're out writing code, they're grabbing data sets, from different places. And this stuff actually did not really go through the data catalog or things like that. It did not get classified. It did not get a million rules applied to it. And so it's basically out there, in the dark as far as the data stewards are concerned. And I can tell you that's something that they're quite concerned about in many cases, because, having, going from 80% coverage and analysis of, some amount of data to, 90% is like not that great if, now there's a whole new 80% of data that you have no insight into. And so I think observability, I think these things converge and they feed off, but like certainly like one aspect is just what touches what. So I think the ability to go into pipelines, basically be generic about what you pull in and what you analyze, I think is quite significant, and sort of understand what the actual usage and impact was. So if a certain thing is always breaking or always causing something else, and it's an initial point, you're getting a real map of kind of the actual dynamics of how your data is flowing versus the intended map of how things should be working in the systems you have insight on. I think more specifically, if you dig into some of these things, like I see the observability sector as a bit more, I would say, performance focused, in the sense of looking at, what's something that's going to affect the outcome of the end result here. And what I mean by that is, like, again, this kind of a little distinction, which maybe is just my, informed by my background and things like this, between kind of the very established BI reporting side of the world and kind of the data product, data service, ML powered, thing on the other side. So when you're, building and deploying a machine learning model, like, you very much care about like subtle distinctions in how the data is distributed and how that's shifting, and is that in a harmful way with respect to the model and things like that. I see observability tools as very much getting into this and being very dynamic, because the thresholds, not to go into all of this stuff, it's a different discussion, but like, the ways that you measure this would change over time, in response to seasonality and different ways that you segment the data and updates to the model and all this stuff. So like all of those things, I don't think any data governance tool like cares about those, because those are not about the data steward's life and kind of making sure we know, we've got a complete map of where things are. Those are about, basically real world performance and impact on things like that. So little different focus areas. And I think certainly, there's tons of room, and it's one of the big things we think about with our partnership strategies is around, there's tons of room for cross collaboration and connection here. So just like one example is, of course, all that great stuff that the observability tools dig into could very well be populated back into a data catalog that's the kind of, owns the experience of where people look for data. And now that's enriched with some awesome information around that, more detailed than you would have gotten otherwise around this. And I think we've actually seen, some moves by some of the vendors there to start bringing in some amount of, observability and quality stuff. I think there's a lot more to do. Likewise, I think, I mentioned, I think one of the big things we try to do at Acceldata is to automate as much as possible and know more. And one of the things that helps, with automation and defining policies and propagating policies across data sets and across columns is metadata about those. And so when we know, this data attribute has been classified in this way, it's used in this way, it's subject to these controls, that actually can inform, the intelligent creation of policies, so that you as the data engineer, instrumenting your things, like, actually don't need to instrument at all, other than say, hey, point to my observability platform and let it take care of the rest. So these are early days, I think, but it's been one of the, I think, learnings for me as I've come in, like, just the different sort of emphasis areas of data governance versus data observability and the different personas that end up using them.
One question, if I can jump in, Kostas. So Tristan, you talked about data drift, which is an interesting topic that I don't think we've actually discussed in depth on the show. But I would guess that most of our audience has like a base sense of what that means. Where have you seen data drift start, like, as a problem, right? Like, and part of the emphasis behind the question is data drift is one of those things. We actually had a guest a couple shows ago who said data is silent, which is I thought was a very interesting way of describing like a lot of the problems or the nature of the problems. Drift is when you discover it, a lot of times, at least in my experience, which is probably on a smaller scale, than what you've seen, but like you discover it when it's a big issue, right? Where you're just like, my goodness. And you realize like, okay, this has been happening for a while. Where does it usually start? And like, what are some of the really early symptoms, that our listeners could look for?
Yeah. So I think the first thing I want to do is distinguish a couple different senses of this. You can tell I was a philosophy major now, right?
I love
it. But I think sometimes data drift, in the data engineering world, sometimes it refers to like schema drift and like, hey, we're changing the structure of this, or like what type of field this is. That's actually not what I'm talking about, and I don't think it's what your guest was talking about. I think what we talk about when we talk about data drift in that sense is basically, changes in the distribution of data. So you've got the same fields, but the patterns in the data are shifting. And I think one of the funny things about this, like one of the things that I learned, is that, a lot of so in the machine learning context, like a lot of the banks, and insurers, like in some sense, banking and insurance are by their nature, like fundamentally about forecasting and predictions and things like that. So like they're extremely mature in how they govern models, since they've been using them for a long, long time. And so, for models, for banks, and insurance companies, there's been a standard measure for quite some time called population stability index, and the various forms of this, where basically you're building, histograms of two data sets. Like one is the data when you train the model, and one is the data, as you just saw it, or in whatever time window you care to define.
Yep.
And basically, for a long, long time, like there's been measurements of this, and you can quantify this and say, hey, if it's above 0.2, like that's worrying, and things like that. And then I think one of the things that's become more sophisticated as more people have adopted machine learning and it's become more critical is like there's actually a lot more techniques to do this now than maybe there once was. So there's a lot more ways to do that. There's ways to do it, using models. There's ways to adjust it for time series, things like this. So it's become almost a routine check in many machine learning contexts. I actually have always thought it should be used generally. Like that shift, it can actually be meaningful, and like it can catch things that are not obvious to people. So I totally agree that like the problem with data failures is precisely that they are silent unless you set up the things to alert them. And so in machine learning, they actually have done that, at least and it's fairly common in like ML ops now. Now, the interesting thing about this, I would say, is like, you've asked exactly the right question from my perspective, which is like, when does this start? Like, because that data, before it got to your model, like it went through a whole data pipeline, things like that. And so, incurred a lot of expense and, touched a lot of things and landed a lot of warehouse. Like, why do you only get it? Why would your alerting only be at the last second, on this thing when it goes into this model? And so I do think one of the opportunities and, for data observability companies is to bring in some of that stuff. And it's not, I know it's not necessarily what data engineers wake up every day and think about. That's exactly why I think vendors, who build this in, like have a lot to offer, to be able to tune this and offer it and just get these checks out of the box for you, and to be able to apply those like on a stream of data, or like on a file, on a JSON file, like before it gets processed and wrangled and all this stuff and ends up in the warehouse. I think there's a lot of things there.
Yeah.
I would say the other problem with that, sorry, is like,
go for it.
It is basically, the alert fatigue thing. And I think that's obviously an issue with any system. I think it's, particularly intricate problem here, because like in some sense we're looking at the carbon monoxide alarm, right? Because like, not to make it more dramatic than it is, but like, it's like, it's something that you wouldn't sense otherwise. You don't know that it's there, and you don't really necessarily know how to, so the last thing you want to get is 100 things. And I've seen people do this. Like, you get 100 things and all my data is drifting. And it's like, I don't care, like mute that. Like no one's going to notice. There's some other reasons it's tricky in machine learning, why you wouldn't notice the effects. But I think, figuring that out and basically reconciling these metrics of drift that people compute now against the actual business, relevance of it is one of the interesting like UX problems that a lot of companies are kind of thinking through now.
Yeah, super interesting. And I think, one of the things that's interesting to me is that in the context of sort of the drift happening at the like final state of the model, is that even then it's sort of a variance on a baseline, right? And so you could have drift that, doesn't necessarily trigger an alert, but that is like damaging in some way, right?
I mean, it's all, exactly. I mean, it's all, stuff is hard to tune in. Like, I think the other distinction is like, we saw this like when I was at Data Robot, right? During 2019 and 2020 and 2021, it's like, yeah, everyone's models were drifting, whether you could quantify it or not. Like, there genuinely was a real change in the world, like of huge severity. And so like there was quantifiable and legitimate drift that you could understand. And we had people, looking at that and analyzing it and adapting to it and things like that. But like, so sometimes it's real, like just the fact that there's an alarm trigger doesn't mean the data is wrong. It could be like, no, this is a genuine shift that you should care about. And like, it's almost as good an insight, as you expect to get on an BI dashboard. Hey, this has significantly changed. This attribute has significantly changed, and things like that. So I think it's, it's one of these things where like people, when I tell them like, hey, we're trying to automate a lot of things and make it really easy for people, they start asking like, well, how do you automate the response? Like, how do you automatically fix it? And like, my answer is usually like, I don't think you can automatically fix some of these things, like, or you shouldn't at this phase. Like, it's very, setting aside the permissions issue to actually affect these things. Like, it's just, there are things that are possible to automate and things that aren't really possible to automate well. And I think judging, the impact of these things, and is this actually wrong? Is there a reason for it? Like, I think that ultimately is a human discussion where you need to go, put your shoes on and, do some detective work and figure out what happened here. And there's no tool that's going to magically do that. The tool will magically tell you about it,
Yeah.
You need to,
Yeah. Can we just spend a few minutes talking about tuning? So this came up, when we were prepping for the show. And I think, we kind of talked about like the analogy of an engine, like building an engine requires you like connecting certain parts. And I think, a lot of people's standard definition of a data engineer is like building an engine that just runs really well, right? Like it's efficient, like it doesn't, have a lot of problems. It behaves consistently. But tuning is really kind of a different skill, right? Like we're talking about performance. We're talking about taking a system and sort of identifying the elements that can be optimized, and then like talking about the ways in which we want to optimize them. And a lot of times tuning is sort of balancing like cost benefit, right? Like we can sort of, sort of accelerate one variable of the equation, but like that may come at a cost to other variables. Tell us about tuning, sort of in the context of data engineering or ML ops, and like, what is that skill set?
Well, I think what's interesting about it is it basically comes back to the diversity and the power of the tools out there. And what I mean by that is one, like a lot of these tools are quite new and evolving quickly. And so, it's not that things are static and you can master it and, you're going to be working with one vendor. It's like, you're actually like always facing this choice to some extent of like, do I use something I know how to tune well? I personally know how to tune well, if I'm a manager that my team knows how to tune well, or do I try something else that like might be a better engine, but I don't really know how to deal with it and things like this. And so I think, this is a choice like everyone is facing all the time. Like, I don't know if you guys have ever done this, but like if you go and look at the DB engines, like page that's showing the ranking of these, like plot a few databases on these, and you'll see like the curve to accelerate to the top to become quite sharp. And so, tons of cool companies on there, but like you see, Presto/Trino, spike up. You see Snowflake, obviously, all these things. Like, and there's going to be more. There's more that are happening now. And so I think like this just shows to me like the ability to choose a better engine is always out there, but you're always facing this risk of like, yeah, I don't know how to deal with that. Like, I don't know how to tune that, and how should I do this? And so I think, certainly one of the things. I'll just mention one other thing before we get to maybe one of the approach. I'm not saying it's a solution, but one of the approaches to solve it.
Sure.
I think the other aspect is like, in many cases the answer, right, is like, oh, well, there's a commercial company kind of backing that and things like that. And like, they can take care of tuning for you and think of that, which is a great, it's a great solution. Like it's value for money on that. But I do think like sometimes people are looking for control, and like, what if they want to do it differently, or they want to customize it, things like that. Yep. Or what if they switch and things of that nature. So I think, one of the things that we try to look at least in the Acceldata world, is try to like, look into these, each of sort of the major, offerings and basically cloud data engines here, in enough depth that like, if you're a specialist in one, like you can, keep operating that as you want, you get all the insights you need. But if there's something that might be a better fit, you can use that inside. You don't need to choose all in one. Which I know, obviously, many of the vendors, not to name names, but like are trying to converge on each other's territory, whether it's data processing or data analytical databases and things like that. So like I don't know that for the actual end user, like that needs to be a one or the other thing at a technical level, at least. Like I think these things can be tuned, through expertise, through data. And that's something software, in my view, should be able to help with if you do enough sort of research and into the actual platforms. And so you should be able to get that out of the box. I think the only other factor I'd throw out there is the cost aspect as well. So many things are solvable through paying more, and I think
all things maybe.
Yeah. Some of these so I think there's always a solution that's to spend more, buy more engines, things like this.
Sure, like the brute force, right?
Yeah, and so like at some point that's not, it doesn't always solve things, but like we have seen like that wasn't possible, 10 years ago necessarily to just say like throw more at this. It's like, well, I need to go back and buy another server that I'm going to put this thing on, and it's like, well, today I just say, yeah, let it go. Or like maybe I don't even need to do anything. It auto scales up, and then I realize after the fact, oh wow, I just spent like $30,000 on this query or something, like running this query for a month, like
yeah,
and someone yells at you that way. So like, yeah, I mean, it's a really complex, like on the one hand, it's become some really powerful tools are available and they're very easy to use. On the other hand, it's become a very complex thing just because there are so many of them and because it's so easy to basically rack up some significant spend on those that might not make some of the people in finance happy.
Yeah.
So it's going to be an interesting time. And I think, we'd all say, like, certainly my view is that, this is going to expand and it should expand. Like I want to see these databases coming up left and right that are specialized for specific things. I want them to be really easy to use. Like that's what's going to help us accomplish these use cases better. It's just going to mean the data engineer sitting in the middle of this is going to have a quite complex world to kind of navigate through.
Yeah, for sure.
It should be fun.
It is fun. And Brooks is telling us that we're at the buzzer here. So I have time for one more question. And this is less on the technical side, but with the show, we want to just sort of help our audience get to know the people who are doing interesting things in data beyond just like the technical components. And so my question is like, what do you really love about what you do working with data? Like what keeps you coming back to working with data, and like, why is the problem interesting to you?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think part of it is definitely just the scene, like seeing some tangible improvement and tangible impact is always significant, or I should say quantifiable, maybe is the better way to put it. So I think, one of the interesting things with data is like, it is structured enough that you can measure, hey, this got this much faster, or I did this much, because I did it in a smart way, I was able to do it, 10 times faster, and I can actually measure that. Like similarly with, I think just some of the things in the machine learning world are endlessly fascinating. One of the most impressive accomplishments that has happened in the world in quite some time. And so, I think on the one hand, just understanding, being able to learn about those is just stimulating in its own right. And, proud to see people building these products and services that use, predictive technologies and things like that, like in a quite smart way that can explain what they are. Like, it's just very cool. Like you can spend forever learning about it. And then I think, what we do day to day, like at Acceldata, I think is rewarding in its own right? Because it's basically, combining those two aspects. So it's taking, like, look, we have crazy data technologies, but, we don't know how to apply them optimally, especially for in a complex, like enterprise environment with a lot of investments already. And then on the one hand, there's this promised land. If I could just get to it, like if I could just get all these data pipelines actually working and running and things like that, I could use all of this awesome technology that's going to help me build things, we can't even imagine really. And so I think, I don't know, it's motivating for me. Like it's sometimes data pipelines, like, it's kind of like messy stuff. Like, it's not always pretty and things like that, and flashy and shiny lights and shiny graphical interfaces and things like that. But it's kind of the part that brings it all together. And so I think it's rewarding to kind of bring something to that group and give them a place where they can sort of accomplish these pipelines a little more easily.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like you kind of can have your cake and eat it too, because you sort of get to address problems on a philosophical level, but you don't have this like intractable, like, philosophical quandary that doesn't really have a solution. You can actually like provide value and make things better and faster.
Yeah, you spin up more engines. That's the practical.
Yeah. Just spin up more engines. Tristan, this has been such a great conversation. We learned a ton, and thank you again for taking some time and teaching us about all sorts of things.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
All right, great show.
Okay, outro take 2.
I guess that's like the back-to-back startup meeting curse.
Okay.
Kostas, you know that I love asking our guests about how what they've studied previously, whether it's academic or not, that's completely separate from data and engineering, influences what they do. And so my favorite part of the show was both hearing about that from Tristan, but then seeing that. I mean, it was so fun for me when, I asked a question and he said, my response is going to be indicative of the fact that I've studied philosophy, and he really, in a very concise way, sort of broke down, in some ways, like the problems with the question, right? Like it requires definition and other things like that. And so I just really appreciate that. And I'm going to continue to ask those questions, which maybe you should, because I think, sort of your lineage, if I can use a term that's relevant to what we talk about on the show, is much more philosophical than my lineage. But yes, I will continue to ask those questions. What did you take?
Yeah, you should. I mean, I think one of the most interesting parts of this show is connecting the dots with what people were doing in their past or what they studied and how they ended up working in with data. So you should definitely keep asking that. And I'm pretty sure that we will be hearing more and more interesting stories. Now, I would say that from my side, I got really finally the answer of what do you study when you want to become a product manager? And that's philosophy. So,
oh, interesting.
Yeah. I was always thinking of, okay, if you want to become a product manager, what do you do? Where do you study? How do you do that? Right. And it made a lot of sense today. Yeah. You go study philosophy, and then you are equipped with all the analytical tools that you need to keep asking why again and again and again and again until everyone in the room is mad with you and they just want to get rid of you. So
and that's actually what shows you that you're doing a good job.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, it was a very interesting point of our conversation today, making this connection between having these skills that you get from studying something like philosophy and actually ending up developing and thinking and designing products. So that was super interesting.
I agree. I feel like I have a very vivid picture of how that should work. All right. Thanks for joining the DataStack show. Lots of great episodes coming up. Subscribe if you haven't, and we will catch you on the next one.